Okay, so let's talk about cloud shells. I get that this may not be the most interesting subject to all involved, but I'll try to make it exciting. If I get boring or if I'm speaking too fast or too slow, we mentioned heckling earlier. Feel free to heckle. Ask me to slow down, ping me on Twitter, take screenshots, ask me why I didn't cover something. It's all fair game. Uh, in return, I get to present remotely. So I feel like I'm a little bit shielded here, which is nice. Though I do regret not being able to join you because I'm honestly not that far away. I'm just up in Vancouver, so just slightly north, maybe a 2 hour drive. But crossing borders is a little bit dicey these days. So I figured this would be the safest way to make sure that I could actually present and honestly share with you something that I really love, and I hope you learn to love, or maybe at least see the utility of. So we'll get started here. So I'll go through this intro as fast as possible to give us more time for questions as we go through, and any of suggestions of tools, because it's not a tools talk, but there's going to be a lot of tools here, especially as we talk about like text-based user interfaces as opposed to like GUI interfaces that you might be used to. You may have suggestions that I've never seen before. I may have some that you've not seen. I'd love to do that sharing as well. I've got some screenshots at the end that we can go over as well. But like, I should back up a bit here and say a lot of the things, like I'm able to enjoy a lot of these things because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So that's to say, like, a lot of work has been put into the software in this scene. So this sort of like text-based user interface scene, especially when it comes to shell and command line tools. And I want to thank the contributors and maintainers for all of this. Like, it's seriously nice to be able to go and have some dot files that I just grab and that can follow me around. So I've got something that can work with me wherever I am, if I'm on like a tablet or a Chromebook or just random web browser. But at the same time, like in a zero trust sort of way, so I can like authenticate and actually make sure it's me, and maybe not work on prod, but at least work in dev and staging on this stuff. So I'm incredibly humbled to be here. I've been using PowerShell on and off since about version 1. I was using it for WMI stuff way back when, and it's been there for me since when I needed to do things like quickly roll out changes, enforce control, and generally get stuff done. So it's actually been pretty awesome, and I'm yeah, humbled to be here. So my name's Ryan MacLean. I love computers. So let's get that out of the way. I've been in the industry for about 20 years now, and I've been writing Go-To scripts since the launch of the Amiga 500. So although I may not look it, which I get sometimes, I've been around the block a bit. So I've got Twitter, and I warn you, it's mostly dog photos, doodles, maybe some retweets of cool things that other people are doing. But I should also admit that I'm like, I'm not the most experienced in all this stuff. I'm like, if you're thinking about a cook, I'm the microwave chef kind of cook. So I'm very good at piecing other people's tools together and getting work done and writing some glue code here and there. But like a lot of what I use a shell for is that kind of stuff. So like break fix, or maybe planning or templating, that kind of stuff. So I'll introduce where I work. This is Datadog. I'm wearing a cool t-shirt here. I think Waldo is actually at the conference as well, my compatriot here at Datadog, who will probably be able to give you stickers and stuff like that. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there to do so. All right, so I'll get the spiel out of the way real quick. So Datadog is an observability platform. That means like monitoring, tracing, telemetry, that kind of stuff that provides full visibility. So like if you're on-prem, in the cloud, somebody else's cloud, across your entire organization. So we enable everyone, that's ops, dev, security, even your business, to have a complete understanding of the system and application performance by monitoring end-to-end from your infrastructure and network to your application and services, all the way to your end users. So that's the spiel. We won't get to that anymore, but we'll start off by showing some quick slides about like Azure app on the iPad. I'm sure some of you have tried it, maybe not gone down this path completely, to see like the fact that you can run a shell on your iPad in the cloud, but also like kind of locally, at the same time maintaining MFA is pretty neat. And I'm not going to say you want to work in this full time. You can certainly attach a mouse and keyboard if you wanted to. But if you need to get something done or quickly check like a resource group or maybe some permissions, that kind of thing when you're on the road, on vacation, if you get to travel, that kind of stuff, like it's there basically. So the reason I wanted to share this talk is that I think it addresses that little itch you get. Something like, hey, I've got a tablet. Could I write code on that tablet and get stuff done? And when you find out you can, maybe you do it for a bit and get bored. Maybe you don't ever do it again. And hey, maybe you used a custom mobile OS. Maybe you found a cool shell app that lets you use a cloud shells provider right there. And again, these things are fun, but maybe what you want is dual monitors, a macro pad, maybe a foot switch. Who knows? But you stay there because you can nest and things and accessorize to your heart's content. You've got your desktop, you get monitors, you get your foot switch, you get your mechanical keyboard. Maybe you get a new terminal app for Windows. But once in a while, only once in a while in your main box, your Lappy 286, your trusty fancy Thunderbolt dongle multi-arm device will find a failure mode for you. It'll fail, and it sucks when it happens. Things go down, maybe it needed some updates, maybe it didn't boot after the updates. So there you are thinking, all I need is a text editor, a shell, a few scripts, and I'm golden, and the gears start turning. This is what we prepare for. So that's my job. That's what I do. I'm in ops. I'm used to working, getting stuff done with like the bare tools necessary. You're MacGyvering with a Swiss Army knife. You're trying to just get the stuff done on the device that you've got so that things keep rolling. You've got a BCP, that's business continuity plan, or disaster recovery DR plan, or maybe just a backup strategy in place. And though it doesn't have that custom new Comic Sans font will be showing off, but it's most of the way there. And so what happened was I got all the things set up and ran into some hindsight 2020, pretty obvious stuff regarding laptops, BIOS, SATA, AHCI, and maybe even some poking around with secure boot, well, for funsies while I was in there. The good news is that I had a second partition with a raw disk from an Ubuntu VM of all things that I could boot to, and perhaps more importantly, get web access. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. It's like you're in this mode, and it's maybe not your main shell, but it is a shell, and you need to get work done. So what does that look like? So as some of you may know, cloud vendors have cloud shells, and they're pretty darn useful. If most of your infra is already there, you even will have a credential provider that you can use when templating, testing policies, or maybe even testing build deploys. So I'm not saying this is the be all end all of cloud shells, but you get an editor and a shell of choice. In Azure, you get PowerShell and Bash for the most part, and anything else you can think of to chain load in some Rube Goldberg-esque subshell inception or scheme. All right, so these screenshots are all from my iPad. This is like the PowerShell mode, the Bash mode, restarting, all that stuff. It works. So here's the Azure Cloud Shell running PowerShell with all my posh. So if you've not used one before, again, cloud shells are online environments accessible anywhere from your browser. Now, the nice thing about these days is like a browser is pretty much anywhere, which is handy. So this talk will cover the day-to-day cloud shell things like file editing, Kubernetes operations, CI/CD monitoring, and coping strategies for the CLI or TUI first approach. Now CLI, by that I mean command line interface, and TUI is like GUI, but it's text-based. So it's a text user interface. We'll also cover how to make some of this workflow repeatable, how to share it with your team, making those setups like the initial kind of like happy path, green field maybe approach, and then a way to get your users or your coworkers or people on your team committing to a code base on day one. And then we'll discuss a little bit about remote pairing. And on the right here, I've just got a screenshot of like the dot files repo on GitHub, which is super handy to talk about like what those configuration files might look like in a text interface that you can bring with you. Again, if there's anything from the crowd, let me know. If the font's too small or if I need to zoom in, let me know. I know this tweet specifically is a little bit rough, but what happened was AWS released a Cloud Shell, and they were talking about how handy it was, and I realized, hey, I could run a fireplace in this. It was December. That's super handy for me. And then I got a retweet back from Corey Quinn of all people saying, don't try to outstupid me. He's got me covered with the Santa Claus hat, sheepdog, good to go. So basically, we're going to talk about ways to set up your own Cloud Shell, what's currently possible, what's coming, and things you can accomplish in addition to the features provided by your cloud provider. But which I mean, like if you want to DIY, like the home lab kind of Cloud Shell for what you're doing, or maybe you're on-prem and you want to have the benefits of a Cloud Shell, the repeatable interfaces, or maybe like a break glass scenario kind of thing that you can do, we can handle that too. And a lot of the cloud vendors are in fact utilizing these open source tools to make their own. All right, so what's a Cloud Shell, right? Like I'm coming back to it again because I do want to demo it. I want to make sure you know like what this is. So this is me running, this is GCP at this point in time, but essentially it is a shell, so that's a terminal interface in the cloud. And you'd think like when I type, it's really slow, but you'll notice like I can type pretty quickly here and it's not that bad. So I'm a touch typer. I'm not that great, but I can get through files. And when I do things like edit files in Vim, I've got a lot of the tools that I expect to be there. When I add plugins, I can certainly do that too. So it'll be a familiar environment. Now, the first question I got from like people when I talked to about this is like, why would you do this? We kind of covered it before, like maybe you don't do it all the time, but like, can I just use my editor? Can I just use the thing that I'm used to in order to get to the Cloud Shell? And the short answer here is an emphatic yes. So in fact, many of the editors now include a shell. Some of them even allow you to connect to remote hosts. One of them even allows you to connect to Azure Cloud Shell, which I thought was phenomenal. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But my scenario had to deal with, the multiple unreliable laptops on different operating systems that didn't have a lot of resources. So this might also apply to those looking to Chromebooks or similar low-powered devices like a Raspberry Pi or something like that. And further, and maybe more applicable to me at the time, is it might be of interest to those in heavily regulated environments. So I had started a new job as ops lead and inherited a project in Flux running app services on Azure. And this was a microservice architecture with each service talking to each other over the internet. And often when things failed, they would take other things with them, causing some interesting failure modes, honestly. So the problems were pretty interesting. We had consultants using Macs and internal devs using Windows laptops that were very locked down, like underscore very here, like regulated environment. So I'm talking about unable to install anything without a ticket, and roughly a 3-day lead time to having anything looked at, as it was outsourced support prior to my arriving, unfortunately. So as a new hire, sometimes you get the laptop that people just, it's got problems. It doesn't boot up half the time, but it'll work. And then while we get you a new laptop, maybe you can use this. So I think my crime here in this screenshot was like running Slack, Teams, and Visual Studio Code all at the same time. I'm kind of demonstrating this because I find it interesting that they're all sort of web browsers. And that's all I was doing, is just running a web browser. So this is on the Ubuntu laptop. You can almost tell here that like I was only browsing the cloud native landscape, but also trying to do something in the GitOps repo and edit a screenshot. He said, my bad. What was I thinking? So it all started by looking at the current environment and trying to figure out how we could get everyone on the same page. We're talking about those consultants, as well as the internal people, and maybe people in other locations. So the external developers and the external contractors. And I quickly realized that things, it seems simple, like, the just word, right? Like just install Docker, were a lot more complicated in a regulated environment. And sure, we could open up tickets, but there was a 3-day lead time and we had deliverables. So some of the stuff, like if we were in a sprint and it needed to be delivered that Friday, it should probably be delivered that Friday. I want to ship things left. So by which I mean, so shifting left, I mean like earlier in the software development process. So like if we've got a workflow that goes from left to right and we're here, I want to make sure that we could cover stuff that was like earlier on in the process here. I want to get it done here. So later on, like, oh no, did we remember to, oh shoot. I need to help the developers where they were, not by finger pointing and dictating, especially since a lot of the native tooling on the Mac wasn't easily acceptable to Windows users at the time. And what I mean was, like, I was on a Mac because that's what I was used to. And unfortunately, most of the devs were on Windows, and like those tools, there's feature parity now, but at the time, not so much. So a lot of times as a consultant in my past life, I would roll up to a shop, like an Oracle shop, an IBM shop, a Microsoft shop, an Apple shop. So there's real benefits to using tools that integrate with each other. So other than like, the one throat to choke kind of approach, so this was no different. So let's see, like within this ecosystem, so what could I find that will work for everybody? So listen, there's a lot of stuff on this slide. You don't need to read it all, but like this is what I came into. So there's a lot of tooling going on. So I'm not throwing any shade. I'd worked with Microsoft tooling in the past. I got an MCSE forever ago. I knew this going in. I knew I was landing into this ecosystem, but some of it, however, was very new to me. Like what was this thing called Azure DevOps? Like I'd never heard of that before. What does an Azure DevOps do? Is it a person? Is it a tool? I had no clue. There's also a lack of like a current architecture diagram and only the proposed architecture that I had seen. So I got started on that first. So let's draw a picture and figure out what's going on. So a quick side note here, and what you're probably thinking is like, hey, Windows Terminal can do all this stuff. So it came up for sure, but it was only available at the time through the Windows Store. And it had been disabled by our IT services team. So for security reasons, like there's games and stuff like that in there, I can understand it, but it wasn't on GitHub at that point in time. I couldn't just download an exe and install it. And prior to coming into this position, I've mostly been using Vim and PyCharm elsewhere. So those are the editors that I was used to. And there were a few people on the team starting to embrace Visual Studio Code or Atom. But at this new job, many were using Visual Studio. So that's Visual Studio no code. So the Visual Studio itself for day-to-day tasks, which is honestly like it's super powerful when it comes to working with Azure App Services and functions, which is what we had a lot of. And being able to live attach a debugger to a running application on the web is super powerful. That's a paradigm shift. Mind you, not necessarily something you want to do in prod, but definitely handy in dev and certainly handy in staging. So we decided to move our microservices monolith to Azure Kubernetes services. So I'm saying all of this just to set up the stage, right? We needed a lot of tooling. So we decided to go to AKS, so the managed version of Kubernetes, and to add in Istio in order to address things like service to service, TLS, and failure back-off retry patterns. So I know what you're thinking. It's a pretty big hammer, and you're absolutely right. We also went ahead with Ambassador as our API gateway, coupled with Okta. So this is a pretty complex change, a pretty complex system, and it also requires like a whole new set of tools. In my head at the time, I'd assume we had solved all the problems. We get devs making Docker containers, pushing them to Azure Container Registry, and just pull them off when deploying to Kubernetes. Simple, right? Great, except we couldn't even install like the freeware known as Docker, as I remember the ticket had in it. We didn't have access to install anything on those Windows laptops, as you recall. So no problem. I installed VirtualBox, no go. Virtualization was disabled for the most part. And when it wasn't, like Hyper-V extensions were turned on, which should be fine, but the permissions were lacking to use Hyper-V. So imagine you've got it there, but like you can't double click on it. It just won't open. So at this point, I decided it was time to grab a spare Windows laptop and see what I could get to get around these Windows problems. And I spent the weekend doing things like blanking the local admin pass on a laptop, getting VTD turned on, fixing VirtualBox using Vagrant to set up a virtual machine image, and then creating an Ansible script to handle this, to install the tools that we need, like Docker, kubectl, Azure CLI, etc. Yeah, don't do any of that. When you're blanking like passwords and Windows from like a boot USB on a corporate laptop, like you're doing something wrong, right? So the following week, we found out what we needed to do was a quick release because we had run into an unrecoverable error in prod, and it literally wouldn't come back. There wasn't any time to get all of this deployed. We need something like now, like maybe yesterday now, like as quickly as possible. And luckily, I spent the weekend doing some stuff, but like luckily at this point in time, our dev manager smartly decided to reach out to Microsoft for help. And I'm saying this like I realize the error of my ways now. Hindsight's 2020. Honestly, I should have done that earlier. But he hooked up some on-site training at Microsoft downtown offices in Vancouver here, and I'm sure it's available in Washington as well, for AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services, with a fellow named Ray Cowell. And I'm name dropping here because Ray honestly saved us and personally taught me a lot. It taught me a lot of like things that maybe I had learned before, or maybe I needed to relearn, and also maybe made me realize that Kubernetes had changed a lot since I had last touched it. So if you're following along, so we're at a point now where like you've got your lead on ops who doesn't have a working laptop, and you've got like prod is down, and at the same time we're gonna like move all of prod into Kubernetes. It seems like a lot's going on here. So in the labs, we also learned that the laptops we brought would not be useful because like we couldn't install any new tools on them. And then luckily, since this was a common story, Ray had a backup plan. So he's like, why don't we just try this in Azure Cloud Shell? And all of us kind of groaned, right? Like the audible groan, like, oh, it's going to be slow. Wait, we're never going to be able to get through this lab. Plus, like prod's down, we're trying to do stuff. Like, how's this going to work? But again, being unfamiliar with Azure at the time, I had no idea what that little icon in the top right of the portal even did. All right, so like I don't have much to say about this slide, but like honestly, batteries included. Azure Cloud Shell had everything we need. A bunch of the benefits, at least like all the tools that we needed were already installed. So whatever recipe we went with, we had like basically some of the ingredients that we require for that like salad or I don't know, steak dinner. They were there, they're ready to go. It was up to us to cook with them. So we were starting out with Terraform. So if you've not used Terraform before, it's a config as code. Sorry, config as code. That'd be awesome. Config as code tool that would allow you to do things like define what your environment should look like, and then run it on a regular basis to ensure that it's still compliant, essentially. So it's similar to like an ARM, or there's other tools that do stuff like this, but essentially like define your architecture and then deploy it. Now, since we were using Azure Kubernetes services, we'd also need kube controller, kubectl, kubectl, and Helm. So we decided to use a package manager, and the one for AKS at the time that was probably the most mature was Helm. I think it was Helm 2. So making sure that we could like take recipes essentially in Helm and deploy them up to our cloud and run the things that we need to know. And then finally we had Istio. So this is our service mesh. So we need something to be able to control the service mesh. Now, what's funny is all of these tools were already in the Cloud Shell. And I'm kind of cheating here. I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but this is like Visual Studio Code running like our bootstrap file with everything all ready to go, as well as on the bottom here, you can see that's Cloud Shell. So it's Bash running in Cloud Shell, but it's Cloud Shell. So the labs were great, and we were all converted. So this was a fantastic way to dev and test. There was one thing that really got us going though, and that's that you can use, as mentioned, Azure Cloud Shell from inside Visual Studio Code. So you didn't need to worry about those tooling issues that we were having before. So this also meant that the timeouts were a little bit more relaxed compared to the Cloud Shell. I'm not sure if you've used it before, but sometimes you will, unfortunately, time out. In Visual Studio Code, we noticed that the timeouts seemed to be a little bit less strenuous, we'll say. Now, I'd love to tell you the entire team started using that same tooling, but what ended up happening is that we got things sorted out in Azure DevOps so that most of these manual operations were handled by pipelines. Now, again, I'm not saying you need to use TUI for everything or GUI for everything, but a lot of the times when you're in a command line interface doing things manually and hopefully documenting as you go, you realize like, hey, if I ran this command that I just ran, then the next command, the next one is like, we got a script here. We could actually start adding this to something that we could do on a repeatable basis, and maybe, just maybe, put it into our CI pipeline. It could be Jenkins, it could be Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions if you want, but a way to repeatedly do the same thing that we had just done on our own as we were exploring. So for me, that meant like, you know how there's IaaS and PaaS. I like to talk about CaaS, so like keyboard as a service. And this is what, as like an operator, someone comes over and they shoulder tap you and they say like, hey, I need to get this done, but I don't have permissions. Can you click this button here, and here for me? Or like, you've got permissions, so can you just like quickly run kubectl and like get rid of something for me? It meant that like, as we realized what these were, we could start adding them into scripts in CI/CD and then run them either as like regular tasks or maybe like a post commit hook. So if you committed something to a repo, it would happen after that. So again, the Cloud Shell didn't necessarily solve this for it, but made us realize like if we did things in a repeatable fashion, we could also make them repeatable in a pipeline, which is awesome. All right, so obviously, like we're up and running, prod's up and running, but I got nerd sniped. If you haven't heard this term before, like it means that I'm stuck. Like I'm in this to figure out just what's going on in this landscape, because I had done sort of the browser-based shell stuff, but it'd been a minute since I'd honestly deep dove and figured out like what I could do with it. So I spent my time trying to figure out how I could push the boundaries of Azure Cloud Shell as a portable tool set, something repeatable. Now, I didn't do this on work time. I did it at home, trying to figure out like what needs to be done? Like what do I need personally to get up and running? Do I need a calendar? Do I need weather? Can I control my music? Can I check email? Like what do I actually need? Can I check on SharePoint? Like where are we at in the workflow process? Like that kind of stuff. And the answer for most of these is like yes, but also you're in a browser, so you could probably just open another tab. Also, I mean, PowerShell scripts are great. You can do a lot with PowerShell, but also like if it's just another tab, it's probably just easier to do that. But I figured out like, hey, this is portable. It's maybe not my day-to-day, but if I had to, I could use this. And if I can do it in this shell, chances are I can do it in most shells, which is really, really powerful. So Azure Cloud Shell not only worked on all of them, so like my Ubuntu laptop, my YOLO installed kind of like artisanal Ubuntu laptop, my Windows laptop that was broken, the hand-me-down Mac that was having issues. It worked everywhere. So I started working on dot files, brew files, shared storage, anything I could do to optimize the experience. So you're probably getting bored here. Don't worry, there's a demo coming up and I'll walk you through it. If I were there in person, I'd do this live, but I kind of pre-recorded it so that there's no demo gods to run afoul of. So problems, I mean, definitely. I had a few. So, you know, when you've got like a recipe and you decide I'll just double the ingredients and then you sort of mess up, like, yeah, there is a bit of that. So like like I'll chain load PowerShell from Bash, and then, but which like context am I in? Or like, do I have a session open over there? Did I forget to save the file? Like some of that stuff came into play. So like making sure that I was auto saving as I went, pretty important, especially if you're changing machines all the time. Like a lot of those things will come up. In the timeouts we talked about, I'll talk about a way to get around that. But yeah, it's pretty handy. One of the first things I realized is that like one, Homebrew will run in the cloud. So Homebrew is like, imagine it's like chocolatey basically. So I could run that in the cloud, but what I had to do and what I'm doing in this demo here is to like git clone it down and then make sure I set my path to where all the files are installed. So git clone, and then I export my path, and then I go into my bash profile, like reload it, and then I install some packages, but then do they actually work? So using the path is pretty easy. The other thing that you probably have noticed in Azure Cloud Shell is that PowerShell is running in Azure Cloud Shell on some sort of Linux system. So all of those commands that you install are accessible in both environments, which is very handy. So for example, in this case, I'm installing K9S from a brew file. The way you do it is you add it to a brew file and then run something called brew bundle, and we'll install anything defined in that file. Now, if the gears aren't spinning already, remember, we had a bunch of tools and things that we needed that were installed, but we might have had other things that weren't installed. And in this case, one of them was a text-based way to update our cluster or see, like within our cluster, what's actually running. And K9S will do that for you. So essentially what it does is it opens up your config, allows you to go into a live cluster and edit it. Fantastic for dev, especially for our devs. So the other problem I have is like, hey, the fonts that I'm used to in typical terminals just weren't available in the browser. And again, I'll demo this in a bit, but basically the sort of shortcut here is to use something called nerd fonts. So nerd fonts will have like a bunch of Unicode things that you're used to, but also will have like logos of things, or maybe like your Git hasn't been committed or hasn't been pushed, that kind of stuff. So like let you know the status of stuff with icons, which is super, super handy. So at the time, I think I was using Ubuntu Mono, and that's what I'll demo a little bit later on. There's quite a few to choose from, though. I mentioned Comic Sans. If you like the Comic Sans font, some do, some don't. It's actually pretty legible, which is nice. But I'll demo it in a bit. Now, we also had a couple of near misses with kube configs and stuff like that. I mentioned weather before, but like obviously, if I want to check the weather, this is just a PowerShell script running from Igor Chubin to check the weather in my area kind of thing. There's a lot going on. So one of the things that I noticed is like I sometimes wouldn't know which cluster I was attached to, and that could be disastrous, right? If you've attached to prod and you decide to start deleting stuff, like that's not good. So what kubectx will actually let you know what context you're in. So that if you want to know, like, hey, am I in dev, am I in staging, am I in prod, it'll let you know right on the command line. So before you enter anything, it can be in red if you want to. Like, don't do that. You're in prod. Careful with the kubectl command you're about to run, or istio-ctl, or what have you. The other one was this Cloud Shell timeout. So again, if you've seen this before, you know what I'm talking about. It's normally not a problem, but if you're running a Terraform of Fly for AKS, it will typically take about 20 minutes, and that's right on the cusp of when this timeout will happen. So what you're doing is, imagine you're creating a cluster, tearing it down, and then creating it, tearing it down, that kind of stuff, mostly for sizing, to figure out like how big something needs to be with your entire infra installed on it. So if you've got a bunch of microservices installed and you want to do a test of the infra to make sure it can handle the load, while at the same time optimizing for cost, for example, or region, or maybe like different instance types. There's different types now, obviously, but there's ARM servers, there's x86 servers, there's different ones that have like faster disks, that kind of stuff. So what you might be doing is rinsing and repeating on a cluster config, but that deployment might take a long time, and you need to sort of make sure it doesn't time out. So one of the things that I got around this by doing was running a command yes. So this is kind of like a deep cut maybe for the Linux admins in the crowd, but like yes it will just pump Y to your terminal. So if you type in yes in a Linux shell and maybe do it, but have Control C handy, it will just print Y for you. And that's great because like Azure Shell will think that things are active, but what I'm here to tell you is that like this is probably not the most secure thing, especially if you're in an office and like you walk away to get like a coffee or a tea or something like that. You don't want like a fully authenticated shell that's got access to all your stuff running with Y in one window kind of thing. Like, don't do that. That being said, if you're in the dev environment, a different account, that kind of thing, and you need something quickly while you're sitting there, this can be handy. Better than like, you know, that thing that will just hit your keyboard like Homer in The Simpsons and just keep it awake. At least a little bit more technical than that, but like just as secure. All right, so the solution I went for with this was like in Visual Studio Code. I don't mean to bury the lead here, but basically in Visual Studio Code, you can run tmux, and in one of the tmux windows, you can run top or htop, and it'll keep it alive while you're doing stuff. Like in the screenshot, you can see I'm using Terraform to sort of deploy stuff out. Again, use with caution, but it will get you out of a bind if you need to. So I've not mentioned this part at all because you're probably thinking that Cloud Shell is a terminal emulator, so like white text on a black screen. But what if I told you you could run Visual Studio Code in your browser itself? So like at least part of Azure Cloud Shell and part of GCP's Cloud Shell, they'll give you an editor that comes with it, and that editor is very similar to, if not somewhat identical to, Visual Studio Code. So a pattern I quickly adopted was to run Vim with all my plugins and such in the Cloud Shell as if I was using like a tainted bastion or a jump host. So imagine like if you logged onto your jump host, that's to say like the secure box that you use prior to hitting your VMs or prior to hitting your managed hosts. Sometimes you can go into a bastion, you could taint it. And by taint, what I mean is like install something on there and then like, is your bastion secure? You don't know, you're opening yourself up to vulnerabilities, that kind of thing. But what you could do is instead put in your Cloud Shell. And then I realized like, hey, I don't need Vim. I've got a full-fledged editor right here with not all the plugins, but definitely has markup. So if I want to quickly go in and edit a PowerShell file, look at some JSON, maybe update a Terraform config, like I can do that all in the web-based cloud editor as well, which is like, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to process. There's many different modes you can use or like ways of getting around problems if you need to do something. So since this is just my Cloud Shell, I felt kind of liberated, right? I could do whatever I wanted in here, set up my environment the way I wanted. Heck, I could even use Spacemacs if I wanted. Like if I wanted to get into Emacs, have you heard of Emacs versus Vim? Like I could do that too. The other thing, so in the training, we touched on that built-in editor I'm mentioning, but we only scratched the surface. So one thing I found, and this is specific to the Azure Cloud Shell, is that I could do things like upload and download files from the computer I was working on. So let's say I was on like GitHub browsing around and I found like one file that I needed, and we're going to use it with attribution, but like I just need that file. I don't need the whole repo. I want to put it in here. What I could do is upload and download as well as manage a file share from there. Whoa, like now we're cooking with gas. So not only can you download files from the shell that you're using remotely, let's say you've like crafted something and you want to grab it here, but you can also upload them. So this is a massive deal for working with Helm charts at the time. So Helm charts had values, and those values.yaml files will contain like basically a config for what you're installing. And as you're iterating through these, remember what I was doing a lot was like creating clusters and trying things out. As you're iterating through them and get like the golden config, you can then pop it into your repo and then like call that a day, which is actually pretty awesome. Because I'd been handcrafting these in the beginning. They're really long files. Like they can be 300, 400, 500 lines long. It's pretty bad. Now, the other thing you can do is attach shares to the Cloud Shell. So if you're running low on storage, AWS is specifically guilty of this, like not giving you a lot of space when you're up there. You can actually map your storage into a subfolder of your Cloud Shell. So like if you've got like a little thing that you know has binaries and stuff like that that you need to transport with you everywhere, you can attach it to multiple accounts if you want to. You can share them across accounts. But maybe more important is you can clone them and give them to your team. Now, AZ copy or AZ copy as a Canadian is probably what you want to use to just copy them. But it's pretty fast. What you can do is iterate across them. So you can have like a day one config for your operators as they come into this environment to get them up and running. Super, super handy. All right, and then since you can export your brew config and mount files, this means you can get your team up and running with a great day one experience. As I mentioned, they can perform GitHubs, work with CI/CD, run audits on your clusters, and work with your service mesh right away. So this is normally complicated. Like this would normally take, imagine you're setting up like a local operator's laptop, like how long that takes. And you can do some stuff in MDT to get Windows like up and running. Like that's Microsoft Deployment Toolkit to get up to like a certain level, like a developer standard image kind of thing, or a gold image if you worked with those before. Heck, you might even have a VM that you're passing around, that kind of stuff. But these are big files, and that's a lot of work, and there's a lot of care and feeding that needs to be done to get them up to date. Whereas this is sort of ready to go. So we can kind of ignore the CPU and memory kind of stuff, and then maybe work just with the storage, which is pretty nice. So it's almost like a zip file. So imagine what you're doing is you're creating like a gold standard zip, and that zip can be copied around the cloud in seconds, like pretty quick, and be added to other users' accounts and mount them as subfolders. It's a pretty powerful paradigm. So I should note, just in terms of Cloud Editor, this isn't the first time I've come across Cloud Shells. And in fact, they've been around for a bit. The one that I'd previously worked with, and this is prior to AWS or Amazon buying them, was called Cloud9. So Amazon bought them. It's got a lot of these features that we're talking about if you are in the AWS space. Like if maybe you're in Azure, maybe you're in AWS, maybe you're in GCP, like they all have their different modes. AWS Cloud Shell is pretty good. Cloud9 is more of like a shared IDE. And one of the nice things it's got is that you can pair with people. So as you're in that Cloud Shell, very similar to like a Visual Studio Code, you can share that screen out with someone else in another editor. They could be right beside you. They could be in another office, different floor, but you can actually share that experience together. And to me, like that is sort of the gold standard. If you can not only like do all this stuff, templated, that kind of stuff, but show people at the same time without them necessarily needing to be sitting beside you or in a war room as you work on something. You know, stuff's down, you want to be on the same page as you work through a problem. So you're training while at the same time fixing something. This is phenomenal. All right, so now I'd like a quick demo of what the AWS Cloud Shell was. So again, I mentioned I kind of trolled Corey Quinn with these flames. So this is what they look for. Maybe you want to keep warm by the Cloud Shell. I don't know. I'm trying to make jokes here. I realize this is a little bit weird, but you can do it. So you can run like animated things in here, no problem whatsoever. If you wanted to do this locally, so let's say you're like an on-prem or hybrid cloud, or maybe you're just at home on your NAS kind of thing. So what I used to use was called Guacamole. Guacamole got picked up by Apache, so it's now an Apache project, which is great. So Guacamole is kind of like a remote RDP, VNC, and shell platform specifically. So I had used it previously to do things like RDP. So when we're talking about Bastion hosts, like imagine that you've securely authenticated to a server on the web, and then using that server, you can spider out to other servers using RDP sessions all in your browser. This was great for us at the time. I was working with some people in Paris, France, and they needed to log on to stuff that I was logging onto, and Guacamole kind of fit that need basically, but it then got increased in terms of features to incorporate VNC, and then further on down the road, SSH connections. And again, this is a Cloud Shell using SSH. So a lot of what I was just talking about with the dot files and mounting things and Git cloning and grabbing drives and that zip file portability also applies on-prem. Now, in GCP and AWS, things are a little bit more complicated, but in Azure, at least, if you do like an AZ login, you get the full credential suite that we were talking about in Azure that's set up, honestly, automatic for you when you log into Azure Cloud Shell. But locally, like it's pretty handy. It'll pop up a browser, you click OK, you're good to go, or it'll give you a link, you pop into a browser and you can like add in the auth code, which is actually really, really handy. Again, what we're thinking about is like portable sort of workspaces, or like a way to resume work wherever I am. Now, if guacamole is too heavy to digest, I'm trying to make food puns here. It wasn't apparent. Weddy might also be worth a look. So I used Weddy when I was working at Samsung, but Weddy is like another, so like a web TTY, so teletype interface. So Weddy is very similar to this. I sort of showed a screenshot of the browser, but it will allow you to run that in your browser. But Weddy's pretty old. A lot of what we're talking about have very similar kind of components. So we talked a bit about Homebrew. If you want to go down the artisanal route, you can do the whole, like, you can basically build your own in case you want to build your in-home tooling. Like Xterm.js is what a lot of these tools are using. If you go to the website, they'll talk about like what they're included in, but Xterm itself, which is like the terminal portion of Visual Studio Code, it's also in Katacoda, a tool that we used at Datadog, as well as Eclipse J, CoderPad, and the awesome command line sharing tool called TTYD, to name but a few. I mean, their list is super long. Seriously, it's very popular with over 50 projects on Xterm.js. So if you're more of a developer than an operator and you want to build your own kind of in-house editor or way of getting started, Xterm.js is kind of what most people are using. All right, and finally, I kind of wanted to introduce Eclipse Theia to you. So this was new to me at the time, but I think it warrants a look. So Eclipse is one of those older, it's been around for a while. It's like a Java IDE. So I had played with it without realizing it on Eclipse Che on OpenShift, which is like the Red Hatty kind of way of deploying apps. And I really got to like the experience. So I started digging into like what they actually use. So Thea is a bit different, and then it's a standalone editor framework. Though you can play around with the Helm chart in the repo or explore Gitpod. That's been open source. So you'll also notice that Google Cloud Shell seems to be using Thea as well. So if you go into the help and the README and the licenses, that kind of stuff, it's in there. So it does mean that if you're using extensions in Visual Studio Code that you're used to, this won't necessarily have all those. It might have different ones that are similar, but not necessarily the same. Whew, that was a lot. Again, if you want to heckle, feel free to heckle. I tend to talk pretty fast. I've had my coffee, but at this point in time, I want to sort of roll into like a demo. I focused a lot on Azure Cloud Shell because that's what I'd been working on at the time. But it's important to note that you can use other providers. If I haven't mentioned that enough, like I really do want to make sure like we will find you where you are with like a backup shell that can get work done. You can also roll your own. So we talked about Thea. The one that's maybe the most prevalent is Code Server. So that's code-server. So like Visual Studio Code as a server. There's a slight change here in that like we were talking about those extensions that you install in Visual Studio Code. So this one has its own sort of extension shop or marketplace. It's got like less telemetry in it, I think was the goal. But it's essentially Visual Studio Code in your browser. So like most of the extensions that you've got, I think they're M6. If you can download the M6 extension, you can install them. It doesn't come with your cloud credentials, as mentioned before, but the others, that's easily sorted, at least in Azure, and for AWS and GCP, not that difficult. So you can add them to like an environmental variable. So you can go through and use PowerShell the same way you do everywhere else, which is great. Now, in terms of a workflow, you can schedule this to turn on when required and off when not needed. So in case there's some security folks in the crowd thinking like, hey, I can't have this open to people all the time. I want to like set when they can come in, when they can't use it, that kind of stuff. So some clouds will have this built into their launch form. If you're just launching like Linux server, code server, I think is the Docker container, you can have it scheduled to say turn on at 9 and turn off at 5, for example, and then turn on as needed. So if you really want to like lock it down, but also have that utility for when you need it, you could do it that way. All right, so now a quick demo of code server. So this is it running in a browser, and I tried to be fancy by like, you know, having it full screen so it looks like an editor. So it looks like Visual Studio Code. It's not, but it's pretty much the same. So it's Visual Studio Code encapsulated into a web app, and you can see like as I go through YAML files, for example, as I make mistakes, or if I'm going through Terraform, for example, you can see this got like little squiggly lines under them to let me know like, hey, you're moving from different versions of Terraform. You probably want to update this so it's not red anymore. So all I'm doing is just like fixing the syntax essentially. So going through something that I was updating and making sure that it's not red any longer. So it's just different ways of like calling the variable names. But what I want to demonstrate is that like, hey, there's extensions in here. And in fact, like if I'm working with multiple clouds, like if I'm working with Terraform and AWS and Azure, I can do that. On top of which I'm in Docker, but I can do Docker in Docker to sort of do those build things we were talking about before. And further, this has a terminal. Again, it's Xterm.js based, but I can open up a full screen terminal and I can start attaching to machines if I want to. I can go full screen and do all these things I was talking about. If I want to run PowerShell, if I want to run Bash or ZSH or Fish, what have you, I can do that. If I want to run Nyancat and just show a cat on the screen and troll my coworkers while they're not at the desk because they left it unlocked, I can do that too. Now, there's multiple terminal profiles. You can open up multiple windows as well. You can leave Nyancat running, similar to what we were talking about before. If you need something that updates on a regular basis, this may be a more friendly way than htop or top. But specifically, yeah, go ahead. Okay, perfect. So what I'll probably do then is hop this down. So I could show you Google Cloud Shell too. The main thing about Google Cloud Shell is it gives you Minikube as well. So if you want to start up like a mini cluster, you could do that too. Most importantly is if any of you have Gmail addresses, all you have to do is go to shell.cloud.google.com with your Gmail account, and they'll give you a Cloud Shell that you can just start using right away. There's no step 2, which is actually quite nice. So if you want to like look at a lot of the examples I'm talking about, it's there for you, ready to go. So I'm just going to quickly probably pop by that demo. and hop into questions, because I talked for a while there. There's no heckling. I expected something. So I'm going to open it up to questions, but I'm like super interested in feedback here, especially if you've got a workflow to show me. It could be like here offline, tools that you've used or other ways of approaching this problem. So like making a command line repeatable for an organization, let me know, or other problems or solutions I've not thought of. Please let me know, and I'll try to repeat any questions that I get for the crowd there. Okay, so I got all of where do you think this gives the most organizational benefit of, and then I lost the last bit, sorry. Oh, bang for the buck. Yeah, so I think, and this is kind of what we do at Datadog, is I think this kind of Cloud Shell stuff is really handy for training environments. So if you've got people who it's like bring your own device, but you need to get them up and running ASAP. So if you're running like an Azure bootcamp or a GCP bootcamp, like a cloud bootcamp kind of thing, or just maybe it's a hybrid bootcamp, I think that's where like you can easily not indoctrinate, but get people used to this kind of thing while at the same time showing the command line. And what I'm trying to sort of plant the seed in is that like, as you're using the command line, do something once manually, no problem. Maybe you're documenting, do something twice and you can start to automate, and do something 3 times, and then you can start training people on the CI/CD process. That's kind of where like that's why I think the terminal is really handy. And that's where I think the Cloud Shell can ease people into the terminal. So I think the biggest thing is training. And maybe the secondary benefit is getting people used to the shell, because some people are scared of it. And then the third benefit is like that rinse repeat kind of thing. So if we're talking about DevOps as like a CAMS approach, so like culture, automation, measurement, and sharing, this is right around the sharing part is where I think it's really, really key. So making sure that you can show people how to share and then get them into the automation. And then when we talk about the measurement, building that into the automation that you're building. So that's where I think like the key like nugget of all of this is like, we're shifting super far left at that point in time, but starting on day one with that training, as you bring in your junior engineers or your intermediate engineers, you're bringing somebody from on-prem to the cloud. I think that's where you can really strike while the iron is hot. Yeah, for sure. So generally you'll have a home folder. So then again, one of the nice things about Azure is your home folder won't be tainted with any credentials or anything like that, like environmental variables. So you can straight up zip your whole home folder. And then like we showed before, you can like just download that. So that's probably the easiest way. So once you've got like a working config that works for you, download it locally, zip it up, share it to your coworker, they can upload it to theirs and do it. If you're an admin, the easiest way is like AZ copy to copy the storage that's associated with. That's probably the easiest way. In the Google side, again, if you're a Google shop, you've probably all got Gmail enabled accounts. So like just bringing up shell.code.google.com is the easiest way to get there. And then the copying, unfortunately, is a little bit more manual. So you'd have to like copy that storage folder that's in Google, but it's not that easy to, so you gotta like mount one and then copy it over, a little bit more complicated. And then in AWS, I think there's actually a way to like template them out. No problem. And sorry, the question was like, what's the easiest way to start copying these around? Sorry for the recording. Awesome. Thank you very much, folks. This is enjoyable.
Thank you, Ryan.